is Hubwood.
Alright everyone, this is a long one again, testing 30 games on the new Radeon 890M with 16 CUs that comes with the also new Ryzen AI 9HX370. In this case I was using an ASUS VivoBook S14 with 24GB of LPDDR5X, 7500 megatransfer RAM, while the maximum TDP of this APU goes up to a whopping 55 to 65 watt when using the laptop's full speed mode. Though I was sometimes using the performance mode of only 45 watt, since it seems as if the laptop gets too hot on full performance, causing some stuttering in some of the tested games. But that's not really an issue because it was basically just as fast with 45 watt anyhow. I recorded all of the today's shown games with an external capture card at 1080p via the HDMI port to make sure there was no performance loss due to recording. While the laptop does have a 1200p screen, I went for 1080p for a better comparability. I did set the VRAM size to 8GB, which leaves 16GB for the system RAM and should be the preferred setting for most scenarios when you're planning to game on such a laptop. Also make sure you're following the channel so you're not missing the soon upcoming full review of this great thin and light laptop, because it kinda is the shit. Alright, and now without further ado, let's start with the benchmarks, which are once more presented in alphabetical order. So today we're beginning with Anno 1800, which I ran at 1080p and medium settings without FSR. I saw an average of around 38 FPS in a pretty huge save game file with a population of around 1 million. The FPS depend a lot on the currently shown area and the camera angle. You can't ignore the 1% lows, as there is always a major frame drop when changing regions. And the frame time graph looks pretty wild, but in that kind of game, that actually doesn't really matter. So it's pretty playable, I would say, while looking fine at 1080p native settings. For Apex Legends, I was using the lowest possible setting at 1080p, as demanded in the comments of similar videos by you guys. So the average FPS was 134, with a decent average 1% low of 93. Perfectly playable, I guess. I did not deactivate the FPS cap though, since it wouldn't go far above 144 FPS anyways, most of the time, and that gives some stability for the frame times as well. Assassin's Creed Valhalla was running with an average of 53 FPS and 1% lows of 33 at 1080p and medium settings. There have been some micro stutters and the frame time graph is quite wild, but actually it felt well enough to enjoy it, and in my opinion it's playable just okay while looking nice at the same time, considering this is an iGPU we're playing it on. By the way, fighting scenes did not seem to negatively affect the FPS. Counterstrike 2 ran fine with 144 FPS on average at 1080p and low settings with FSR set to performance. As always, the 1% lows have been very low, though I did not feel them. It's just an ongoing issue with the game itself. And I also want to point out that the overall FPS range is pretty wide, with around 90 to 160 FPS depending on which area in Dust 2 I currently walked around. Especially on a smaller 14-inch screen, FSR performance looks decent enough in most cases in my opinion. For Cyberpunk 2077 I was also testing AMD Fluid Motion frame generation. For this to see, the AMD overlay needs to be activated, as MSI Afterburner can't catch it. So this basically doubles the FPS, leaving me with a whopping 84 FPS on average, with 1% lows of probably around 66 FPS at 1080p with medium settings and FSR on quality this time. Now, I know these aren't like real FPS, but it felt fluid and while looking pretty darn amazing for an APU. I wasn't able to spot any major fragments caused by the generated frames. I mean, this just used to be one of the hardest games to run only like 3 years ago, and now performs really good on an integrated GPU at medium settings. Crazy. Even though frame generation was the reason for this outcome, of course. For the Dead Space remake of 2023, I was using the low preset, which still looks pretty good, combined with FSR set to performance. Now, this resulted in pretty awesome average FPS of around 72, but the 1% lows have been rather bad, caused by some seldom stutters like this one right here. Though besides that, it was very playable overall, and maybe that could be fixed with an FPS cap or driver updates of some kind. Diablo 4 ran perfectly fine at 1080p with medium settings and FSR set to performance, with an average of 94 FPS and a 1% low of around 79. You could probably turn FSR down to balanced or quality if you're okay with 60 FPS here. There's really not much to say here besides that, well, so let's just jump right to the next game, I guess. I don't personally play Dota 2 and didn't want to ruin anyone's gameplay experience, so I used the live stream function, which actually renders the game the same way as if you played yourself. So at 1080p and the highest settings, I saw an average of 89 FPS with 1% lows of only 48, probably caused by what you can see here, this Velcro tape-like looking frame time graph. Though such behavior is usually not noticeable when playing it, and it seems to be pretty fluid after all, in my opinion. I ran Elden Ring at 1080p with low settings and activated anti-aliasing, and that resulted in an average of around 50 FPS with 1% lows of 34. Some occasional microstutters or hiccups as seen in the frame time graph, but playable overall and a decent experience nonetheless. For full disclosure, I was only testing the main game, not the new add-on, as I didn't have the time to play that yet, and probably won't, as just finishing the main game made me kinda depressive, to be honest. For Fortnite, I was using low settings with epic view distance and activated shadows in the DirectX 12 mode. That resulted in pretty good 104 FPS on average and decent 1% lows of 72 FPS, while looking much better than the performance mode, which you could of course choose as well for FPS above 144 FPS, I guess. Fortnite actually was one of the mentioned games where I had to choose the performance mode over the full speed mode, as otherwise stuttering would occur, most likely due to thermal throttling of the APU after some time. For Forza Horizon 5, I was using the medium preset at 1080p without FSR, resulting in a very decent average of 93 FPS, raising the Colossus event. The 1% lows have been alright as well with 69 FPS. Now, Forza Horizon 5 is really well optimized for these AMD APUs, as we already learned from handhelds like the ROG Ally or the Legion Go. Wasn't expecting anything less. You could probably also use high ultra settings if you're okay with 60 FPS or an FPS cap. The 8GB of VRAM would surely come in handy in that case. Genshin Impact ran perfectly fine with a stable 60 FPS on average, with the high settings at 1080p. The 1% lows have been around 58 FPS, so just perfectly fine. Now, I know the early regions are supposed to run a bit faster, but as we can see in the GPU usage, there is actually quite some headroom left, so I'm sure you could play the whole game without any issues. And if they should ever occur, lowering the settings a bit would always be an option. I was using the low preset with the resolution set to balanced at 1080p in Helldivers 2, which resulted in a perfectly playable average FPS of around 65 with good 1% lows of 52. Quite surprising, though you can actually see that I was using the balanced resolution scaling due to the rather blurry edges. Still, it was fun to play and worked just fine, and I would definitely consider playing it that way, so it might be worth a buy if you're thinking of getting it for your upcoming Radeon 890M. Hunt Showdown ran with an average of 57 FPS using the low preset with 1% lows of around 42. Though here once more the stuttering occurred after a while if I wouldn't change the performance mode one step down to performance. And to show you what I mean, I added this to the video. You can see it right here in the frame time graph and the actual footage. Some rubber banding effect, making the game actually unplayable. Didn't happen on the performance mode though, only on full speed. Also again, probably caused by the high temperatures, as you can see here, causing the CPU to throttle down, as the GPU clock speed and usage didn't seem to be affected. For Hogwarts Legacy, I was just taking a long walk from the school's dinner hall to Hogsmeade and the forest behind it, just to complete the trip with a short flight on the broomstick. At 1080p medium settings with FSR set to performance, that resulted in an average of 58 FPS with 1% lows of 34. Keep in mind that this game's 1% lows get much better once you have actually entered a region or area when it had the chance to preload everything properly. So take that result with a grain of salt. Should be better in the long run considering the 1% lows. Also, AMD's fluid motion frames could be a good option in this case. Kingdom Come Deliverance is still looking pretty nice, especially in the forest. So at 1080p with a medium preset, I saw an average of around 100 FPS when using AMD fluid motion frames once more. I assume the 1% lows have been around twice the afterburner reading again, which would mean they have been around the 70s overall. And so it's perfectly playable while looking pretty nice. Maybe even the high preset would be doable if AFMF is able to double the FPS if they are a bit lower to begin with. Again, at an iGPU at native 1080p, pretty amazing. And these forests surely are still one of the best looking video game forests of all time. Also quickly testing League of Legends at its high settings at 1080p, and that resulted in 238 FPS on average with a good 1% low of 189 FPS. Perfectly playable as expected, most likely even playable at 4K without issues, I guess. So let's just jump right to the next game. I was also testing the great Manor Lords, the Game Pass version, at 1080p with medium settings and FSR set performance, which resulted in around 48 FPS on average and 1% lows of only 20 FPS while building a bigger town. Once again, a game where some stutters etc. won't impact the gameplay that much, and it's been perfectly enjoyable, though also using FSR on balanced or quality settings for better sharpness might be a good idea, as I think it's just playable with 30 FPS as well. Maybe a bigger bandwidth bus than the measly 128-bit would have helped a lot in this case. Who knows? For Microsoft Flight Simulator, I was testing medium settings at DirectX 12 with FSR on balanced, flying over New York City, and that resulted in an average of 43 FPS with 1% lows of 20. Decent enough for this game, as usually fast movements etc. aren't necessary. Flying over the Himalaya near Mount Everest resulted in even higher 62 FPS now on average with decent 1% lows of 37. So it really depends, but nonetheless quite impressive I guess. For Minecraft I was testing the Java version at high settings with two different amounts of chunks. With 25 chunks and some flying and walking, that resulted in around 63 FPS on average and 1% lows of only 20 FPS. With 20 chunks, that already resulted in 101 FPS on average and still pretty bad 1% lows of only 21 again. I guess the bad 1% lows have also been caused by flying over the landscape so fast. Probably actually playing it in a regular way on the ground would get you better results. If you have any requests or tips for future testing this game, feel free to let me know in the comments. No Man's Sky was running with around 54 FPS on average with the low or also called standard preset and FSR set to performance once more. The 1% lows have been okayish with 29 FPS, but as you can see the frame time graph look quite weird. Definitely some driver issues, which we would have to keep in mind actually for all of today's tested games. Maybe AMD can improve the performance over time in a noticeable way. I tested Overwatch 2 with medium settings at 1080p, 100% resolution scaling and activated FSR, and it ran pretty well that way, 90 FPS on average and a good 71 FPS for the 1% lows. Even in heavier situations, the FPS stayed pretty stable and the performance depended more on the region of the current map. And if you need more FPS, you could of course always lower the settings, as the difference between the graphics presets in that game isn't that big. A PUBG match on Erangel using 1080p with low settings and high textures resulted in a decent 88 FPS on average with okay 1% lows of 59 FPS and a mostly stable frame time graph. Quite enjoyable and definitely playable even if you're a bit more sophisticated in this game, I'd say. Even a FreeSync monitor could make sense in some of today's tested games, and this is one of them. The VRAM usage was quite high in this case due to the higher settings for the textures, but thanks to the 8GB of pre-allocated VRAM, that was no problem whatsoever. I usually like to test Red Dead Redemption 2 with the recommended hardware on box settings, and also did that this time. They present a mix of mostly high and ultra settings with some medium and low options as well. You can easily find these settings via Google or YouTube, and they look super good while still providing playable FPS, in this case when FSR was set to performance. 46 FPS on average with 1% lows of 28. The frame time graph was okay most of the time, with some scenes having a few issues though. Still, I'd consider this playable with great visuals, especially on a 14-inch screen. In Starfield I saw between 60 and 80 FPS on average depending on the area, with medium settings and FSR plus the game's internal frame generation activated. Very fluid, looking just fine, and stable frame times. Nothing to complain here really. Walking indoors provides much better frame times and frame rates as outside, so it really depends I guess. Hard to fully benchmark this kind of game that way, but definitely playable after tinkering around a bit in the settings. And finally, adding the finals to my benchmark parkour. Your requests have been heard. Ran great actually. 91 FPS on average at 1080p with low settings using high textures and FSR set to performance once more. The 1% lows have been okay with 57 FPS on average. The frame time graph was pretty stable of the whole match with almost no micro stuttering. Playable just fine really. So next game. Thanks to 8GB of VRAM and frame generation activated, The Last of Us Part 1 ran much better than I actually expected. I was using the medium settings with FSR on performance, and it once more showed that with these techniques, it's insane what is possible with an iGPU these days. 90 FPS on average with 1% lows of 68 FPS. Great frame times, really perfectly playable while looking great at the same time, I kid you not. Also a quick test with Trackmania, which I personally don't play, but since it's quite popular, I decided to add it as well. So forgive my non-existing driving skills, thanks. Using the fast preset at 1080p resulted in around 126 FPS on average. The 1% lows have been relatively bad, probably due to these micro spikes that you can see over here in the frame time graph, though I didn't seem to notice them despite being pretty sensitive to micro stuttering, so probably a driver or game engine issue with the frame time graph. But overall it was perfectly playable anyhow. Valorant is very CPU based, and the beast of a processor, the Ryzen AI 9, was able to show its muscles here. 363 FPS on average using the lowest preset with 1% lows of 184 FPS. By far today's best result. Not much to say other than I suck at these games, as I don't play it. Sorry, well, yeah. I mean, even a 200Hz WQHD monitor could make sense in this case, which is crazy once more. However, I was not able to blame the laptop for my bad performance. Well. And Warzone actually ran better as expected as well on the minimum preset with FSR set to performance. I saw an average of 101 FPS and 1% lows of 61 FPS, which seemed to stabilize more and more the longer I played, so they might even be a bit higher in reality. Some micro stutters here and there, and certainly not perfect, but doable for most casual gamers, I would say. And the last game for today will be The Witcher 3 at high settings in combination with FSR on performance. Now, in my opinion, they really destroyed the game's performance with the next-gen update, but it is what it is, right? 51 FPS on average with 1% lows of 39 FPS. I mean, of course, it still looks pretty good, and it is of course playable that way. It just would have performed much better on the old version, probably even without FSR. And that's all for today. Overall, the performance is quite decent for an iGPU, though the laptop surely is bandwidth limited with its 128 bits. Though I'm excited for the upcoming AMD APU with 40 CUs and the 256 bandwidth bus called Strix Halo. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel in case you want more videos like this, or if you don't want to miss the full review of this small ASUS VivoBook really soon. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.